Hello, everybody. I'm Alan. I hold shift out of Frio.
And I'm Austin Visions Neil.
This is the Defuse, your CMG post-game talk show on everything going on with the Call of Duty League in 2020. Obviously, here specifically talking about what's going on with day number 2 of the CDL London home series. Let's get this fuse lit. We got a lot to talk about. 6 games to go through. The first one, an absolute banger. New York going up against Dallas. Well, I'll say, Austin, we thought this was going to be a banger. Ended up it would not be. As Dallas would come through, they were able to take the Gunrunner hardpoint first, a very tight Arklov peak search and destroy. And then from there, Dallas all over the Gunrunner domination for what was a surprising 3-0 for the Dallas Empire.
This was a real big match, I think, for a lot of people in the community, right? And as well as these teams. We haven't seen Dallas in a while. We weren't sure exactly where they stand for as far as every other CDL team that we're considering for as far as the top right now. And New York was one of those teams, right? They came off of their own homestand. They came out with a win, and they were looking pretty good. Looks like they were fixing up a lot of those mistakes. But they meet a team like Dallas, and yeah, I mean, you're seeing plays like that. Shotzi was just having his way in some of the search and destroys.
Yeah.
Crimsix really looked on form with the assault rifle when we were watching him play. I think there was a lot of great takeaways from the ARs in particular here from the Dallas Empire, which was definitely one of the big things, at least that caught my eye. And that's really important for the squad, right? Because if you have, Shotzi and Illy and Hook, who seems to always go under the radar, doing what they need to do, it sets up them so well when you have your ARs doing what they were doing today, which is dropping insane numbers, having some really high KD stats. And if they can do that going in towards tomorrow, well, yeah, they're looking real good. But coming up with 3-0 here was, I think, a big surprise for sure.
The other thing too, we were waiting to see exactly what Dallas is going to look like with the new AR style meta, and Cryptix was actually one of those guys that pulls out the growl. And I feel like this game was 100% going to be a statement game one way or the other for the Dallas Empire. You win it, okay, you're absolutely still a top 3 team, potentially conversation for the best in the league. But for New York, depending on what happens, if you win or lose, we kind of look at you with either extra favor or maybe we start to second guess ourselves. We obviously had a very convincing tally here, a 3-0, where the Dallas Empire really looked controlled all the way throughout it, with maybe a couple of exceptions on that Gunrunner hardpoint to start, where Shotzi would eventually go beast mode to lock things up. But they get a 3-0 versus a team that just won their previous home series. Definitely says to me that this Dallas Empire team is a major contender, without a doubt, even in this current meta. But on the opposite side, this is a major statement for the New York Subliners as well, where it comes down to, well, what happened? You just 3-0'd the Chicago Huntsmen. You've played the Atlanta FaZe very well, but then you get absolutely smoked here by Dallas. Maybe this squad isn't ready to quite be in the top 4 yet.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't completely convinced either that, this New York squad was, was going to start running through competition, especially at the top when they meet some of these other big teams. And I mean, that shows today. I really just think that they all came together and had themselves just a really strong weekend. And yeah, we saw a FaZe, that's not the same FaZe team that we saw in the first half of the year. Chicago Huntsmen, I think, definitely was a big takeaway, right? Beating them 3-0 was something that I don't think a lot of people did expect by any means. And that was a great win for them. And that's what maybe thought, all right, this team does have the potential to take down some of the top teams. But I still just don't think I was totally convinced until I could see it again. We didn't see it again, and they really, I think, just got put through the blender for the most part here through a lot of their maps today.
I'm kind of in the same boat, and it's definitely not a good standpoint to be at for the New York Subliners. Of course, we'll talk about what happened to them in their last chance qualifier, but moving forward, the London Royal Ravens, of course, in your home series, they're hosts of this home series, play up against the Florida Mutineers. Not a game that I think many people would have expected to be as tight as it was, as not only does London go down 0-2, but they find themselves a very strange and rare domination win on a map mode combination where they were getting absolutely beat up. Again, Petro domination. They got triple capped in like the first minute and a half. It was about a 30-40 point game, but London were able to snap back mostly off of Dylan, who's able to get himself a 10 spree to close things up. And then past that, Gunrunner and then Arklov Peak would be map 4, map 5, in which London secured themselves a very surprising reverse sweep.
This was a crazy series here for London, and any fans, I'm sure, having an absolute blast at their homestand right now. We were kind of talking about it, man. Imagine if this was on land right now. Like, there would just be a crazy riot in the stadium that, with both of these teams in here. But overall, seeing this matchup come through, and like you said, Dylan goes on the spree, brings things back. This is a team I feel like really builds a lot off of momentum in particular, and that's what we see here from someone like Dylan, who's able to take over things the way he did. But overall, I mean, that was a crazy bounce back in the Petro, where we did not think that there was going to to be any chance they were going to be able to come away with a win against this team here. Florida Mutineers on that map of game mode is something that we don't see very often. I think that's just their overall second loss on the game mode itself at that map. So the fact that they're able to do that and just bring things back for us, Alan, was really just, I think, a pleasure to be able to watch here. And it seemed like they were coming together with a lot of those, big plays, and a lot of those mistakes they were making in previous events now seem to be at least somewhat fixed, and was obviously a massive statement game for themselves to complete the reverse sweep.
It was a 2.5 incredibly dominating maps from Florida. I mean, London had 55 points off the first hard point at Azir Cave, and they
Yeah.
finished with 129. I mean, Florida absolutely destroyed them on the Azir Cave. Mutineers were able to dominate on what was the Piccadilly search and destroy, mostly from getting aggressive through the middle of the map. And like we mentioned, they were able to find not just one, but two different triple caps on the first half of the domination Petro. So the fact that London were able to keep themselves composed to get that reverse sweep was a major surprise. And I think that at the beginning of the weekend, we were saying, yeah, it's probable that London could make it to the playoffs. They've got a pool where you feel like if you just can compete with Florida and then are able to beat the other players, no problem in your group, which they probably should have. Yeah, they could make the playoffs, but this was a very surprising path for London to get in from the winners bracket after not only the reverse sweep, but also the games yesterday where they looked very, very good throughout. And it was one of those things that we just never know what kind of a London Royal Ravens squad that we're going to get. So, in your mind, was this performance, especially in reverse seat fashion, enough to give you consideration that London could potentially win it all this weekend?
To win it all, I mean, there's definitely a chance. It's possible for sure. I mean, if they keep rolling like they're doing right now, there's a good chance that they might be able to do it. We don't know how they'll match up against if they get to that finals against Florida Mutineers, but I think there's an argument that could be made that they could definitely do this. I mean, this is almost just kind of looking the same way that New York did their home series win, right? Like they just built off of momentum. There's a lot of great backing that they're getting from their fans at their in particular homestand here. That's the exact same thing that could end up happening here for the London Royal Ravens, and I mean that's definitely a possibility. The big thing for me, I think, is Scraps. If Scraps can keep doing what he did today in particular, then I think that that's absolutely a chance that they might come away with the entire thing.
Well, I'll say this much. Scraps has been absolutely extremely consistent since he's picked up the AR. I would be even willing to say that off the break, he is probably one of the best respawn players off the break. How many times has Scraps come off of a respawn, whether it's a hard point or domination, with 4 or 5 kills straight? I mean, he was 7-1 two different times today as he was kind of coming through off those respawns. That's impressive. I'd say Pharaoh's another one that kind of stands on my mind as far as people that come off the break with a lot of fire. The player that we have not heard enough about, I want to say this year, though, has been Dylan. We talked about Shawnee being a little bit all over the place. Dylan has been good, but not as great as he was at Black Ops 4. But he does have these couple of clutch up moments. That's one of those guys that I feel like for London to do well enough to win a championship, you're going to need a good performance from Shawnee, but you're going to need another explosive performance, I think, from Dylan if they want to have a chance. It's a tall ask, to say the least, but I'm definitely surprised with the path that London has built so far. And I would not be surprised considering that, as we'll learn here in a minute, they'll be playing up against the Paris Legion to get into the grand final. So as far as opponents you would want to see in playoffs, that's going to be one of them, I think, in their minds. So moving forward, though, speaking of the Paris Legion, they played up against the Los Angeles Guerrillas first. This was a rematch from last weekend, and it would see similar results. Not a 3-0 this time for the Paris Legion, but still a very convincing performance with the exception of the Ramazza hardpoint, which was our map 1, where Paris did start off, I would say, stronger than LAG, but they beefed a couple of rotations going from 2 to 3 to 4 that allowed LAG a chance to get back in. But from there on out, a very dominating performance for Paris, a 6-0 on the Arklov peak, and then a 197 to 124 in the Petro domination, in what was, I would say, one of the more embarrassing dominations we've seen so far from LAG, and that's saying something.
Yeah, it is absolutely. And I think the big thing here for me, for as far as seeing this Paris squad, is that we actually got to see other people, I think, step it up on today, which is something we haven't really seen throughout this entire year. It's really just been, all right, well, Paris wins when Kismet goes clutch. That's really been the X factor for me, for as far as when we see them come out with W's and take series wins, which is not very often. But we saw it today. Shox was able to go big on a couple occasions, especially in those respawns. We're seeing Zed. I know he dropped, I believe it was a 30 bomb that came in with almost 2 minutes in towards the hill in that game number 1. So you're seeing other players now start to contribute contribute towards the success that this team is able to live up to. We saw it at the beginning of the year when they were playing on land, but they've had a very difficult time translating that on towards our online format here that we have within the CDL. But I do have a little bit of confidence. I think, seeing them today, it's going to be really hard to make an argument based off of the history, of course,
Yeah,
of the last
that's
couple of
true.
series. I mean, absolutely. But I mean, looking forward, if you can continue to do this and have all these other players start to actually contribute in towards slaying and playing for these rotations, setting up and getting yourself in towards a spot where you can contest these other top teams, you put yourself in a spot where maybe Paris can look to fit in towards some of those other spots that we have here that are still up for grabs with all these teams that are so close in points.
Now, on the other side of things, for the Los Angeles Guerrillas, with this loss, their regular season comes to a conclusion. And with 50 points, the best they can finish is essentially a tie for 11th or 12th, depending what happens with the Seattle Surge, as they still have one more weekend to go. But I
Mhm.
believe that head-to-head series does actually tilt in favor of the Seattle Surge. So if I'm not mistaken, this is LAG finishing dead last in the CDL with this conclusion. And after what was a very good Minnesota home series, we started saying, okay, you bring Saints back into the lineup. He's doing very well with Vivid. Their slaying power is up. Everything's looking good. Yeah, their domination was still suffering, but at least their losses were close. Now you've got a situation that over the last handful of maps and rounds, well, the last 2 weekends, they've only won 2 maps. They got 1-3, 0-3, 0-3, and then 1-3. This team is looking like they very well could be right back to where we had them a couple of weeks ago as being the worst team in the CDL. We said that they needed to be riding off of their search and destroy. Those were the keys to victory versus Atlanta. Both times they played them a couple weeks ago. They have won a single search and destroy map in the last 7 chances they've had to play search and destroy. So there's nothing going right now for Los Angeles.
There's really not. I mean, you look at that search today, and Luca just picks them apart, right? And they're not able to
Yeah.
deal with the sniper pressure. And yeah, that's a big problem, and it's so surprising, right? Because you look at this squad. I think I've said this before, where you have people like Vivid, like Blast, who in a lot of ways came up through a lot of that scene within the search and destroy community, and for whatever reason, it just seems like they're not able to translate that in towards team play here with the rest of the teammates. Even Aqua, somebody who's actually been fairly good within search and destroy in that game mode itself, and still not being able to put it together and piece it together as a team. It's really just individual players that, yeah, they're good, but that doesn't mean that it's going to necessarily work on paper when you put them all together. It doesn't mesh. It hasn't been meshing. And there's a serious problem here for this LAG squad where I look at this roster, Alan, and I don't really see anyone that's like, all right, this dude can take over a game. I think there's a lot of, right? There's a lot
I've
of
said
players
this
in
since
that.
day one, man.
There
Since
you go.
day one of this team.
And I mean that's the big problem where you
Yeah.
have just about everybody else, even on these weaker teams, that have a player that can do exactly that.
Yeah, there is nothing overwhelming about this roster, I would say, in any fashion. You thought that maybe when Spart was brought in that he would be the little bit of the young gun flavor to get them over the edge. Not the
Mhm.
case. Vivid starts to show up later saying, well, maybe I'm that guy. But it really does feel like if Vivid's not playing well, LAG doesn't stand a chance versus anybody.
No.
Anybody. I mean, it's hard to kind of rationale them that they are any better than the worst team in the game at the moment, considering the fact that they're 1-4 versus the Seattle Surge. They've won
That's
5
tough.
total games, man. 5 total series is what they've won out of the 22 that they've played. It's not good. It's not good right now for LAG, and my hopes for them in playoffs are not at an all-time high, especially considering that, again, we've been talking about the fact that out of every single mode out there, it's been surprising to see how good this team has been at search and destroy, but we haven't even been able to say that, and the fact that they've only won 3 domination maps is it's not good. It's just not good at all. I think Maven was trying to be very polite when he was talking about it before, but it's been bad. It's been absolutely atrocious. And you kind of heard it as well. I don't mean to kind of harp on it too long, but in those team comms that they've did the listening with, it was like a pub game, man. Everyone's just calling out where they died from, where they saw someone. No one was directing traffic. No one was making calls for plays. It just felt like they were kind of mildly walking around the map looking for kills, man. It's just something is not clicking with this LAG squad. And at the same point, you were talking about the fact that no one on this roster really stands out for you. No one on this roster stands out for me as a leader either. It's
Yeah.
just, someone has to be that guy, and it just feels like for no instance throughout this regular season has anyone really stepped up for LAG. It's been tough scenes to be sure. But I'm sure we'll spend more time talking about them as we come to the conclusion with the season. We have to move on. Speaking of Seattle, who again is looking for a win to make sure that they are not in a 50-point tie with the Los Angeles Guerrillas. They would have a chance versus OPTIC Gaming LA. And to be fair, this was a chance that you thought, well, maybe they could find a way to get a W for a moment, as the Gunrunner hardpoint was very close, although very sloppy. And then Optic Gaming LA would able to destroy Seattle Surge on the Petro Search and Destroy. Seattle would bounce back with their one map win on the Hackney Yard domination before Optic Gaming LA would put any hopes of a victory for the Seattle Surge to bed with an absolutely dominating Hackney Yard hardpoint 250 to 140. And I will say this much for Optic Gaming LA, the rookies have showed up again in a big way for day number 2 for them.
Oh man, I mean, I was a big fan when I saw both of these players come in because obviously we've been watching them quite a bit within the challenger scene. So to be able
Yeah.
to see also Draza come away with what was, I would think, a pretty good showing here for himself. Hollow right behind him, but I think that this is really, this was the fix, I think, to this roster. You need a good smoke player, you need someone to be the bomb carrier for the squad. Draza fits that absolutely beautifully here. But the flip side of this coin for the side of Seattle, I said yesterday, you know what, after the way that they had lost, which was obviously a very unfortunate map number, I believe it was a map number 3, where they had a leg out that came in there for themselves. And it was just, unfortunately, I think, just over for them. I think mentally, Octane lost full on Twitter, went on to make a video today talking about everything that's happened. I think it's just a buildup, and he finally exploded. And I really don't think that there's going to be a way to bounce back in towards the mix here for this squad in particular. Octane's been frying the entire year. Even today, he's still, like, every single time he gets on the sticks here, like, he's just putting up the numbers. It's just, unfortunately, I think Proto had a real slow start towards the series in particular. I think after 3 maps, after 3 maps we had went through, I'm pretty sure he was like only 20 kills in after 3 maps, which is just, I know, absolutely unacceptable. So that is real tough to say the least for themselves. And yeah, I don't think there's going to be a way for them to bounce back here, Alan, especially after another loss here at the No2 weekend.
Yeah, and Optic Gaming LA, you have to feel good about the changes thus far, especially considering the recency of these rookies coming into play. But for Seattle Surge, you mentioned it. This is the big conversation point, is the fact that they are absolutely down, and they very well could also be out here because they've got one more home series left, sure, but it's the Toronto home series, in which it's a very heavily stacked roster worth of teams. You've got Atlanta, Florida, Dallas, Chicago, Toronto, and this Optic Gaming team that's also there. But I guess the bit of good news is, even though Seattle does play up against the Chicago Huntsmen first, they would get then the loser of Optic Gaming LA and the Toronto Ultra, both of which are teams that all 3 of those teams actually desperately need a win. Obviously, only one of those 3 will get one potentially off the start, unless Seattle can surprise Chicago, which I don't think anyone's predicting. So this could be another instance where the Seattle Surge, they're in a position where if they want to break out of the bottom 4, they have to essentially win the upcoming event, which I don't see them doing. But to try to give themselves a more favorable matchup, you're going to have to win at least one map, or probably not one map, one match somewhere to try to get out of the cellar, because that's currently where they reside as far as points, like I mentioned, with that 50-point tie with the Los Angeles Guerrillas.
Yeah, and I mean, trying to say that you can make an argument to do so, it's just, I don't think it's going to be there for them, really.
Yeah, same.
It's just been such a problem with this entire squad because they've looked at trying to add in some additions throughout the regular season. Just a lot of people have tied up with contracts. There's not a whole lot they've been able to do up towards this point, and it just feels like, all right, this is the cards that they're dealt. This is what we have to deal with, and let's just see what we can do. And I just don't think that it's enough. And I'm sure it's at a point where people like Octane, Slacked, and I'm trying to think of their third here, Apathy, for as far as some of the main players on this squad that have had success through so many multiple CODs, and not find it in this one is just got to be so frustrating. It's like, what can we do at this point in time? And that's why I think that there's really going to be no coming out. And I think that they might just be down and out here for the remaining of the year, because it is just so difficult as a team that has really talented players that have found little to no success over the entire year and is now built up with all this frustration. It's starting to explode. And I just think it's really just mental boom moment here for a lot of these guys.
I'm right there with you, 100%, absolutely. And here's the other kind of thing: as I'm looking at the standings, they're not fully updated on COD Game PD at the moment, but like we had kind of talked about at the beginning of this weekend, Optic, Paris, Toronto all tied at 70 points, Seattle at 50, and a tie for Los Angeles Guerrillas. But with Paris winning 2 maps, they're now at 90, Optic's at 80. And now the Toronto Ultra are going to be in a weird spot. We'll talk more about that bottom 4 potentially as we move on to the show. But going on forward, as far as our matchups, New York versus Paris. Like I mentioned, Paris did find a way to get 90 points, giving you the results in case you didn't already know. Paris find a way to surprise the New York subliners in another stunner, as Paris don't just win this series here, Austin. They win it in 3-0 fashion.
I mean, you could have told me I could have not watched the matches today, Alan, and you could have bet me a bunch of money saying that, listen, I'm telling you, this is what had happened, and these guys are going to win the entire thing. And there's no way that you would ever believe it. 3-0? Like,
No
I'm
way,
still
dude.
scratching my head here. Like, it is just absolutely insane. And this is one of those moments where, again, I think, like I touched on it earlier in their series before, where a lot of other players are now starting to step it up. And I don't know if it's maybe just coming to the point where they're starting to click. They're starting to get a grasp of some of this new meta that's been implemented here with some of the ARs. But I mean, again, I think it's just really just a lot of these players starting to step up in the final moments here in these final weeks of the CDL. And that's just got to be such a great breath of fresh
Yeah.
air. But New York, man, wow, just absolutely wow. The fact that you lose now what is 6 maps in a row after winning 12 in a row from last weekend, it's just like such a kick in the teeth. It's like, yeah, things were going so well, we were
Yeah.
looking so good, and then it's like, well, how does this affect them, heading in towards what will be a little bit of a break before they go in towards God champs?
I mean, this was not just losing. This was losing in a way that did not represent any instance of how New York played yesterday. And like you mentioned, they go from a 12 map winning streak now
Mhm.
to a 6 map losing streak. That's not all that common. I don't think anything quite like that has happened yet in the CDL, but there were some really bonkers plays that were happening, especially on that Petro Search and Destroy, where there was 1v2s that were going awry, 5v3s that went awry. It's just basic things that we thought New York had cleaned up, polished. It was good to go. Their search and destroy was on a high rise after the last weekend. They were not there whatsoever. And then the Gunrunner, I was about to lose my mind. There was one moment when we were watching the games together on the Gunrunner Dom. I was like, has New York even seen the inside of the boiler room yet? Like, they just kind of avoided the entire middle of the map, and Paris was just moving around Gunrunner 100% for free. These were things that we had concerns about weeks ago, and we thought for sure were alleviated. And I'm so glad that Chance had brought it up when it talked about, as you're a New York subliner, coach, analyst, player, fan, whatever it happens to be, you have one hard veto map for each mode out there. If you're going to hard veto maps like St. Petra on Domination, you cannot be that shaky on Gunrunner Dom. You have
Mhm.
3 maps in total to prepare for it. If you're going to sit there and say we're not preparing for one of them, there is really no excuse to go 130 to 155 on the first attempt on Gunrunner earlier, and then a 137 to 170 on Gunrunner for your second attempt. There's a lot of questions for me about this New York Subliners team after they come off their win of their own home series last weekend now.
And Kismet said it right in the interview. He's like, listen, he's like,
Yeah,
any team that's
what are you
letting
doing?
us play
Yeah.
domination Gunrunner, it's just not doing their homework, and they are just not paying attention to what's happening in the CDL. Is pretty much how he bluntly put it. And you have to agree, right? It's like if you're not going to be able to kind of adjust and fix up these other couple of maps, and you're going to hard veto one, then you absolutely have to be very solid at the very least on the map that you're willing to play. And I mean, that's just kind of what I look at for as far as when we get in towards some of these later stages and going towards God Champs, where it's like, all right, some of these teams now might be willing to try and change things up in towards their maps, because it's like, all right, every single time we play this team, they veto this map. So like you can play around those map vetoes, a little bit differently. You can try to play out some maps that's like, okay, we're not great on this one, but they're hard vetoing this, so let's just play them on it because we can probably likely take an advantage against it. And
Yeah.
if that's just the spot that you're in, as you know, New York, you're across multiple different game modes where you just cannot play a specific map and you're hard vetoing it, it's just going to leave you in a real tough spot heading towards God Chance, where there's other players and rather other teams that are just going to be able to be more flexible across those maps that you're not good on, and they're willing to play it because they've gotten better at it. And it just almost seems like it's at a point where New York is maybe not investing the time to get better at those maps, and they're just going to kind of almost play a 50-50 on a map like Governor up against Paris.
The thing about it is the New York Subliners, after winning their own home series last weekend, have locked a middle 4 position in the playoffs.
Mhm.
So why not try different maps this weekend? I mean, if you're
Sure.
not going to, if you're going to be trying different things on the online scene, on the servers, on stream against, other tournament ready teams, why not try something different? I don't know, man. I was absolutely baffled by the map picks for
Sure.
through and through, and how New York looked this time around when it came down to, again, the fact that they have a domination where they've played exclusively Hackney Yard in the last like 7 maps in a row. You get 2 Gunrunners back to back. The only other map you have to prepare for if you're going to hard veto Petro, and they look that shaky on it. I'm just very concerned about the outlooks of New York as they approach towards playoffs. But we still have some time to talk about that as we go. So Moving on forward, Optic Gaming LA would get a rematch versus the Florida Mutineers. And you thought for a second that based on Optic's performance earlier in the day versus Seattle, that they might have a chance versus Florida squad. And there were moments where you thought, oh, yeah, very well could be the case, as Optic Gaming LA were able to take advantage of a Florida Mutineers choke really from P4-5 and then into the bridge when it came down to the Ramaza hardpoint. But then from there on out, Florida said no more nonsense. They take the Gunrunner Search and Destroy, the Hackney Yard Dom, and they close out of the map 4 hardpoint relatively convincingly. But it's one of those things that it was still a couple of shaky moments, with the only exception being the fact that I feel like no one had been talking about Awakening in the day number 1 or the early stages of day number 2. He forced us to talk about him here in this matchup versus Optic Gaming.
Did he ever? I mean, there was a point where he was just popping 3 and 4 kills, like you could see. Like when you have someone that's just doing this here for you, it's just something that is just irreplaceable at the very least. It's just doing wonders on the map. And we saw that exactly in this game. He did slow down a bit in the map number 1. I think that's when we saw Optic come through with a perfect rotation, like you talked about, to the bridge, where I think it was overall just a mistake from Florida Mutineers, right? That should have been their game if they closed it out, or they should have closed it out and they didn't. So that was just, I think, a little bit of a mistake on their part. It costed them, but they move in towards these other game modes. Havoc starts to make some plays for us there in the Search and Destroy. Things start to look a little bit cleaner and more crisp as we move in towards the Hackney Yard, where maybe there was a little bit of a moment where some Hackney Yarded action did happen towards one of the spawns. But nonetheless, you could still see that was a very close game. Optic had a chance at taking it, and they were unable to come through. But we go to that Azir Cave, Alan. That's where everything just completely turned around for us, because there was a point, I remember I said it, we were obviously watching the games, and I'm like, Optic actually looking pretty good here, Alan. They're looking pretty good. And then I think I went to go to the washroom and get a drink, and I come back, and I'm like, what in the hell happened, Alan? Like, it's just like they were at like 150 points. And it's like when I came back, they were still at 150, Florida's over 200. So
Yeah, man,
they won every single hill in a row. And it's just like, wow, like the fact that this Florida team can just turn things on like this, when rotation after rotation after rotation, is just is unbelievable. And they're the reason why they are the number 1 team here in the game.
Well, look, Florida put on a masterclass on Azir Cave hardpoint today. The fact that they were able to get so many clutch exits from 2 and then get their way on to contest for 3 and then do the same thing going to P4, you don't see that all too often.
No.
And I think that, I'll have to go back and rewatch how they played it versus the Dallas Empire a couple of weeks ago, because they played a really good game there last they had a chance. And what has really changed for the Florida Mutineers as far as their approach to Azir Cave, because they have been absolutely filthy on the mode and whole. But like we were talking about, in as much praise as we want to share to Florida, there's a lot to talk about as far as what the bottom 4 of the league are going to look like potentially going into playoffs. As we'd already mentioned, that Paris Legion, London, Optic, all playing this weekend, and Seattle for that matter, and LA for that matter, all had to come through and have good weekends coming forward. We've got ourselves a situation where it really is going to be down to what happens between Paris and Optic at the tail end of this weekend. And then beyond that, what can Toronto do going forward into the weekend after? So for the bottom 4 implications, here is your current standings. LAG, like we mentioned, completely out. They're in number 12's position. I believe they locked that because they do not hold the tiebreaker versus the Seattle Surge. You've also got the Surge that have not found a win this weekend. They're only at 50 points. And then, like we had mentioned, going into this weekend, it was a 3-way tie at 70, but now Paris has overtaken Optic Gaming LA. The better news about all of this kind of bottom 4 implication is that you've got Toronto, Paris, and Optic, I believe, all playing at the Toronto home series. No, Paris does not play. So you've got Toronto and Optic that are still in the mix. In terms of really outside of Optic game, or pardon me, Los Angeles Guerrillas, when it comes to that bottom 4, who are you looking at right now, Visions, as potentially being the team to get out of that bottom 4 to survive that losers bracket in round 1?
Toronto, absolutely. And I mean, I hear some sighs in the background from Justin Pistachio, but I'm gonna tell you why. Absolutely, and maybe more tell Justin why. But I think that this is a squad that's been on the up and up. They made a couple of roster changes. Kleenex looked absolutely phenomenal. They added him in just a couple of homestands ago. They put Classic back in towards the mix, which I think is the right call, because you can trust in Classic a lot of the time to be able to make those big plays. And and if you can have trust towards some players like the veteranship here of Classic, who's been brought in from all the way, I think, from Modern Warfare 3, he's been playing this game. So he's been playing for a very, very long time. And I feel like he hasn't been the player that's probably been, talked about the most because of who he teams with. Typically, there's usually some bigger stars in the lineup that I think overshadow him. But he's a player that I think is going to bring a lot of communication, a lot of leadership and shot calling towards the mix here, which you no longer have because Looney, of course, is on the bench. And I do think that Toronto is going to be on form here coming in towards this homestand. I also think that they take the favorite side of the bracket that they will have going in towards it as well. So they will have at least a little bit of that favorite playing with them. But they need to see hot starts. I need to see, that the same Toronto Ultra that we got from last series or last homestand, and see if they can get themselves towards that point. Because if they can, then I believe that they're going to be able to propel themselves here with could be an amazing run at their own homestand.
Look, Toronto's got the hardest path to make it into the middle four. They're going to have to make the playoff at their own home series and likely win another game. They're going to need the 30 points to get over the top of currently where Paris is. And beyond that, what my pick is, I've got Paris getting out of the bottom four, mostly because they're currently sitting at 90 points and they play the London Royal Ravens tomorrow. That's a matchup that they very well could win if they keep playing like they did today. On the other front, especially because the graphic is lending us towards who makes it, OPTIC or Paris, OPTIC has a really tough run. They do have to play Toronto first, and then after that, they would have to beat either Seattle or Chicago if they win against Toronto. That would be, I think, kind of an easier fare versus Seattle, obviously a much more difficult one versus Chicago. OPTIC has a chance, I think, to win two overall matches they still have left, but right now, I think Paris has the best chance of actually surviving out of the bottom four simply because they did what they had to do this weekend. They won the two matches they needed to. They get into playoffs, and all of a sudden, you're playing up against a London Royal Ravens squad where the two heavy hitters in Florida and Dallas have to square up against one another. This is a very potential opportunity to where Paris could actually make a grand final for the first time. On the opposite side, for the London Royal Ravens, with them making it into the playoffs, they have essentially secured themselves a middle four position, so they don't have to worry about getting knocked down into that bottom four anymore, which of course I think is a good segue to bring us into what our playoff picture looks like going into tomorrow. We already kind of talked about it a little bit. You've got Paris playing up against London first, Austin, and then of course Florida versus Dallas. Not at all, I think, the set of matchups that we were expecting coming into the Sunday, and a very interesting one because, like I just mentioned, you've got London and Paris playing up against each other for a spot in the grand finals.
Exactly. What of them are going there? And I mean, I still think that it's going to be London that's going to take that series. I think for sure. I believe that they're going to be feeling really good. It's going to be really good for the mental. I think for people like Dylan in particular, who has had a little bit of a rough year, and is going to be able to come out on top, which was an amazing win in the 3-2 reverse sweep fashion. I think that they're going to have enough to be able to take down Paris up in that semifinals. But Paris could end up surprising us. Alan's shaking his head. You can't see it on the screen right now, but he thinks that he's going to maybe run through here with the Paris Legion squad.
Yep.
I don't think that's going to happen at all, Alan. I think London is going to shut them down, and they're going to shut them down hot.
London has won a single domination in the last 7 matchups. Beyond that, they've won 2 dominations in the last 13. And Paris has been nearly flawless in their search and destroy this weekend. I think Paris takes the dom. I think Paris could take both searches. I've got this going game 5, but I've got Paris winning this one tomorrow. I've got Paris making the grand finals. They have played search and destroy near immaculately this weekend. Granted, they haven't played up against the hardest opponents in the world, but that said, they have been flawless so far, including a 6-3 win versus the Dallas Empire, who is currently the second best team in search and destroy the league.
No, it's not. You're not selling it on me, Alan. You're not selling it. I just
3-2
don't think
Paris.
there's enough, for as far as like these players. I think yes, I made an argument for as far as other players starting to step it up, but I just think that they're not going to be able to do the exact same thing tomorrow based off of what I've seen past the with the other homestands. Maybe they'll carry the momentum from today where they did look pretty good, right? They 3-0 New York, but I still don't think New York is still the best team to really give them. All right, now I have trust in Paris. I just think that they've had such a lackluster year for the most part since things have went online that I think that when we get towards that series, London's going to take it in 4. I think they'll win 3-1, taking the hard points. The search, I think, will be absolutely close, but I think you can make an argument that London was also starting to tear things up in some of the search and destroy maps that they had today. Some players stepping up, Scraps in particular for the most part. Dylan looked a lot more comfortable, I think, too, based off how they're starting to play. It's just really, I think Shawnee's the question mark. Maybe if they get Ramaz search and destroy, it's locked up, guaranteed. But I think Shawnee is still the only question mark on that roster for me, and I think has to show up tomorrow if they're going to be able to make any kind of a run.
Look, if you were watching last week, you're probably going to be looking at my take here and saying that I'm flipping my position harder than a Republican before a national election. But the fact of the matter is, the Paris Legion have looked incredible this weekend. And as still one of those things that for the London Royal Ravens, they have not convinced me in domination. They're still looking shaky in their search and destroy, where even if Wuskin is able to find multiple snipes, they're still losing rounds. I don't know, man. I've got Paris. I don't know if Paris can take a hard point off of London if they play at the highest level, but even if London's playing at their best, I still think that Paris can hold themselves up to potentially take a search or a dom. But not just take one search. I think they can take both searches based on how they've looked this weekend. It's kind of similar shades of the Chicago Huntsmen from the weekend before. Other side of the fence, though, because we got to get to this one.
Yes.
You've got Dallas, you've got Florida. This is going to be an interesting matchup because Florida has showcased some weaknesses. You kind of heard at the very end with the interview that happened that, hey, we have been kind of playing around with different setups and different comps because of the meta swap. And it looks like finally, with that setup versus OPTIC getting LA, they've kind of reined themselves into what feels best for them. But the problem that I kind of am looking at is the fact that the Dallas Empire have been near perfect all weekend, with the only exception being that search and destroy versus the Paris.
Yeah, this is a real hard one to break down here between these two because, like you said, Florida they finally show a bit of weakness and they lose the series here with Awakening, which is the first time that we've been able to actually witness that here for ourselves. So yes, you see that they can bleed and you can take them down. And I do actually think that Dallas is going to take this one. I think that this is very likely going to go towards a game 5. Stasho gives me the let's go in the background here, and I do think that they're going to take it again in a game number 5. I'm seeing Crimsix, and that was, I think, the big factor for me for as far as, all right, Crimsix is getting himself in towards champs form, and that's the biggest important piece of the puzzle for this entire roster. We've seen Shotzi do it. We've seen Illy do it. The Hook takes a very supportive role here in towards the mix for his teammates and is taking maybe a back seat, but is still doing his job. And Placer's just been absolutely frying the entire year. Crimsix was just the missing piece for me. I haven't seen Crimsix do what he's been doing, when he was on Complexity, when he was on the Dynasty of OPTIC, when he was just taking over games. Today, he wasn't necessarily taking over, but he was putting up some.
He had a couple maps where he did, though.
Right? I think that the big one was in some of the hard points for the most part here. Just being able to match some of the slaying power is really the factor for me. If we can get that at a Crimsix going forward, which I think we do, because if you remember, I've made the prediction that Empire is going to take champs.
You did
get there, and I think that this is really going to be the driving factor here, beating Florida tomorrow.
The only big monkey wrench into Dallas losing tomorrow is going to be if Awakening plays like he did in that most recent matchup versus OPTIC Gaming LA. Dallas is going to have a lot on their hands. And I hate to put it all into one player because there were moments where also Frosty took over a little bit in that series versus OPTIC Gaming LA as well. And I think if he can have big games versus Dallas, Florida can win that series. As far as what we've seen so far through 2 or 3 matchups just this weekend, though, Dallas is looking like the stronger squad through and through, especially considering, I won't lie, I was a bit torn after I saw Florida drop that massive lead they had in the opening real 6 minutes when they played London on that domination on Petro, a map that they have been notoriously nasty at. And to be fair, Dylan does kind of have a special moment to secure them that comeback essentially. But there have been some questions with Florida when it comes to their search and destroy. 2 losses already in the weekend and around 11 versus OPTIC Gaming, where they had to win round 10 and round 11 to make sure they were able to kind of come back against OPTIC Gaming. And OPTIC isn't necessarily the strongest search team in the game. So yeah, I'm a little bit woesome and worrisome about Florida, especially in their search, and if they can actually dominate on the domination. And beyond that, I've got them splitting the hard points. I've got them splitting the searches, but I think at the moment have Dallas taking the domination. I've got it going 5, and I got Dallas taking it, unless there's a massive performance from Awakening or Frosty. We already know that there's going to be consistency out of Pharaoh and Skies, who've looked absolutely insane throughout the weekend. Havoc has also played very, very well, but it just feels like to me, if one of those 2 players can have another performance like they just did versus OPTIC Gaming LA, but versus Dallas, that's going to be their win condition going into tomorrow. So we'll see how things kind of occur. We are taking viewer questions for you guys. We have a couple of good ones already queued up for us, but we will be taking more. So if you want to jump on over, I believe exclamation point questions or giveaway in the chat will showcase the Twitter link, which will give you an opportunity to go over to it, respond to the Twitter feed itself. And if we answer your question here live on stream, you earn yourself 5 free CMG credits. Not a bad way to earn yourself some free money to play around with on the CMG website. So taking a look at some of the questions we have so far, this is a really good one. After another poor performance from Seattle, asks Harry, where do you think they are going wrong? And do you think it's time to sign/draft new players, or is it too late for that? What's your view? I guess we'll kind of get your take, Austin. What's your total view in the Seattle Surge roster?
Yeah, you need to add someone in here. I mean, what do you have to lose at this point, right? It's almost just like at a point where it's like you're losing so much, you haven't found any success, nothing is clicking, nothing is working, and I think you just throw Enable back in towards the mix here. He's a veteran player. He hasn't looked great when he has been added in towards the roster, but Proto is the issue for me. He hasn't been looking that much better, and I have much love for Proto as someone who's came from the same scene from me back in the PS3 days, but overall, like he's just not, unfortunately, I think living up to what they need, and I think you just throw Enable back in. The problem I think is like you can't really get anyone else. Everyone's pretty much signed, and contracts are really strict now that we're franchised. So I think Octane's been very vocal, like, listen, we've been trying to get other people, we simply cannot, and that's been the big problem. So I think that you throw Enable back in and see if you can get any kind of hope here at the end of the season.
How demoralized that if someone like Octane is sitting there saying, "We've been trying to make swaps." Like, imagine being the other four players in that team. Like,
Oh, true.
oh, you have? But I think you're right. I loved that Proto got a chance. I don't think he's ready at this level. He's still making a lot of challenges occur on the map that just don't feel like professional level chals. Although Enable maybe doesn't do that necessarily any better. Like you mentioned, he does have a little bit of extra leadership quality to him. And I think the role that he was trying to fulfill back in the old meta is going to be a little bit more freeing now that you got a couple extra ARs watching over the top of you, so you're not forced to entry and find multiple kills at the SMG. I
Sure.
think that there is an opportunity for Enable's playstyle to work, but I think it just comes down to can you get the rehearsal. But I think in the offseason, if they don't make any swaps, regardless of what happens, they need to be looking at something because Octane's insane. Apathy's been
Yes.
playing fine. Slack has been playing fine. I can't really say anything too negative about them. It's just as a squad, they don't have that X factor outside of Octane. You know what I mean? Like, how many of our top teams do we list off two or three different players saying that these guys are a duo or a trio that dominate maps? We can't say that about anything going on with Seattle outside of Octane, who's been absolutely incredible considering the circumstances. So, regardless of what happens with the playoff roster, which I agree with you, I think Enable does need to make an appearance. Beyond that, I think you need to be looking at some of the top amateurs, whatever happens in the LCQ, or especially in the AM finals themselves. Try to lock them down now. So if we are still living in a quarantine world, you can make whatever moves possible to get them here sooner rather than later. You could start working on that synergy now because it can't be one of those things that you just pick somebody up mid-season next year off the challenger seat and say, let's give this guy a go. That's just not
Yeah.
going to work for you. I feel like you need to develop that talent now, even though there will be a pretty lengthy offseason between the end of playoffs going into whenever the start of next year would be. But yeah, I agree that there needs to be something big happening in Seattle between now and the start of next year for sure. For Simeon, he asks, is this the best meta Dallas has ever played with since the beginning of the game? And will we see Dallas back on top after this week? The whole thing comes down to me. You beat Florida. You probably win the grand finals. You're number one in my book in the power rankings for sure.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly said. I was probably gonna come through with the exact same thing or very similar, but yeah, I mean, like I think the argument's made. Like, yeah, whoever takes this series here tomorrow, I believe, but here between Dallas and Florida is probably winning the entire thing, right? So that's the matchup, and that's really the determination where we come through and say, all right, Dallas beat them. Yes, they're a top team, and they're on playoff form. It comes down to again C6, I think, being the X factor for as far as whether or not they do that, and well, awakening for you for as far as Florida are able to do that. But I think that if they absolutely take this tomorrow, then they'll be back on top. And I do believe that this meta is absolutely fitting them, right? Crim6 is an AR. You look back to every single team he has ever played on, and he's always been one of the ARs. The exception maybe Black Ops 2, where he was running an MSMC with Ix and TP. But other than that, yeah, I think that this is just a comfort zone here for Crim6. He's not a super cracked out player per se here, like we have some of our other just crazy movement players. They have Shotzi, they have Illy for that, and he just needs to post up with an AR, do what he's doing today, and I think that this meta will favor them, and they will get back on top.
Yeah, my big question mark, I think, and we didn't really mention this, but I think it is important to note that for that Florida Dallas matchup, Dallas is 3-0 in domination versus Florida, but 1-4 in hardpoint versus Florida. So that's one of those things that will this meta really favor Dallas? We'll find out pretty quickly when they get to go up against a very strong Florida team in hardpoint specifically. I think if you could take whatever your map choice is for that, you should be good to go. I've got them winning the Dom. I've got them at least winning one, if not both of the search and destroys, depending on what Florida puts together for tomorrow. That's going to do it for all of our viewer questions. Again, we do take these every single day at the end of our shows. So if you missed a chance to submit this time, make sure you submit next time. That said, though, We will actually not be back immediately following the games tomorrow evening, as a handful of us have some other commitments to deal with. So we'll be back on Monday evening to recap the entire event and likely give more of a full end of the regular season, what the playoff implications going into Toronto will look like for every single team that are still involved. It's going to require us to do some math, which is never a good thing, Visions. I'm actually terrified. Why did I just say we're going to do that? We shouldn't do this.
Shocked.
Shocked it. We're not going to be back on Monday. Just kidding. We'll be back on Monday. But until then, there, Freds, make sure that fuse doesn't fizzle out. So long.